My name is Dennis Winslow. Today's date is January 30th, 2019, and I'm conducting an oral history interview with Jeff Winter in Roswell, Georgia. Jeff, let's start with your growing up period. Where were you born?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, right after World War II, 1946. We lived in my grandfather's house, and I have an old picture that shows me on the little table in the kitchen, not the dining table, but there was a big AM/FM phonograph machine there, and I was playing records on it, and I was, I don't know, 2 or 3 years old, but I always remembered records and always was fascinated by radio, and I mostly grew up listening to, at the time it was the popular music station my parents always listened to, was WNEW. And I continued listening to them for a while. I got into rock and roll when I was about maybe 10 years old. I remember Elvis first time on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I remembered going to elementary school and just being gaga over the whole thing, and I was a rock and roll fan, and I guess Peggy Sue was one of my favorite numbers, and Party Doll with Buddy Knox. That's one of my favorites too. And at one point I left rock and roll, and I think I was maybe 11 or 12 years old, and just went back to pop music, Sinatra, and Torme, Lena Horne, Count Basie. That was my music, and that's what I stayed with, and that was what I enjoyed.
Did either one of your parents have a musical background?
Well, my mom was a great singer, and I think she really could have made it, but her mother would have no part of that, and her mother just would not let her do it. But my mother had a wonderful, wonderful voice, and my dad, no, I never. When I got a tape recorder, we would get him to sing occasionally, and he just sort of crooned in there. But he's not a showy guy, so. But he could carry a tune. But my mom was great, and but other than that, when we were growing up, I have to tell you this. I can't tell you how many times my mom kept us out of school. I have a sister that's 3 years younger than I am. She kept us out of school, and she would take us into Manhattan. We would take the subway, or my dad would drive us into Manhattan in the morning if he was going to work, and he would drop us off. And we would go see TV shows and radio shows, or we would go to the Paramount or the Roxy Theater to see one of the performances there. She just had us do that, and it's just, and I remember those. I remember I forget how young I was, but we saw Johnny Ray in person, and the people were screaming, and I was this 4 or 5, 6. I was older than that, but I remembered I was just traumatized by all the noise in the theater. But I could still see Johnny Ray up on stage, and the microphone came out from beneath the stage, and he did all those Johnny Ray tics that he had. But we did go to a lot of. I remember we went to, I think the show was Break the Bank. It was a radio show. We went to a lot of TV shows. But every once in a while, she would keep us out of school, and we would go, and we would do these things. And I think so. So that sort of thing is in my blood. And I was always fascinated by the production value, and of course, possibly being a performer.
What did your parents do for a living?
Well, my mom was a homemaker, and my dad worked in actually, it was a dying business from the time I was born. He was in the hat business, and what he did was, it was a printing company. They printed the inside leathers, the sweatbands of men's hats. So business kept going down for years and years. until the Davy Crockett hat came out. Then and they got a lot of business back then in the mid '50s. That was a nice bump. But he was the foreman in a factory that did that, and he was on his feet most of the day, and he didn't own the company, but he just worked there. He was a hardworking man, and that's what he did.
And the one sister?
No, well, she's 3 years younger than I, and then a surprise sister came when I was about 11 years old. She's 11 years younger than I am, and she's very artistic, and she could sing as well, but doesn't really sing in public, but she can carry a tune. And I'm so proud of both my sisters. They're both they were very accomplished. They became teachers, very special teachers, and they taught special students, and just had a wonderful way about them, and got the most out of children, and just wonderful. They had great patience and great intellect, and they're just good ladies, good people.
Where did you all go to school?
We went to public school. I went to PS 200 in Brooklyn, in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. Was there from first grade to sixth grade, and then went to Bensonhurst Junior High School, Junior High School 128. That was also obviously in Bensonhurst. That school was actually down the street, I think, from where Larry King lived. Because he also, when he was on the radio on his all-night show, he used to tell stories about the people in that school. And I remember he talked about Dr. Irving Cohen, who was principal when I was there, and I think he was principal when Larry King was there. And Larry King is at least 25 years older than I am. So Dr. Cohen was there for an awful long time, but there were some characters in that school. And then I went to Lafayette High School for my through my junior year, and left. We moved. My parents bought a house on Long Island, so we left this tiny apartment in Brooklyn where we lived, and moved to Long Island. Completed my last year of high school in Baldwin Senior High School. And while I was there, I actually became the school announcer. And in the morning and afternoon gave the Baldwin bulletins, and I think I did the Pledge of Allegiance every day, and ran the national anthem I learned how to slip cue this record that they had a local recording company made, and they had an acetate record of the Star Spangled Banner, and I would wet my middle finger and hold my finger on the acetate recording, and then when it was time, I would let it go and it would run. But the the Caliphone phonograph that they used never ran at the right speed. It would always be slow, but somehow in my reading of the Pledge of Allegiance, it would get up to speed. Well, one day it didn't, and it ran slow when I started running the Star Spangled Banner. So I flipped the machine to 45, and it sounded like Mickey Mouse, and I heard a roar from just sitting. I did this from the dean's office, but I could hear the roar from around the school of everybody laughing. That was the only time that happened. That was surprising.
And then when you went to college, you continued your interest in broadcasting and radio.
Well, I didn't go to college. I'm a high school graduate. And following high school, at this time, I actually had a radio station in my room. When we moved out to Long Island and I had my own bedroom, I put together a radio station. It was before we moved out to Long Island in 1962. It was June of '62, but it was around February or March of 62, that while I was still living in Brooklyn, I went with my friends to the annual New York Automobile Show, and they had that at the New York Coliseum. And it was a big event, and we took the subway and went into Manhattan. And as we walked into the Coliseum, before you ever got to see any of the cars, WNBC was broadcasting out in the lobby. Well, I didn't see a single car. I stood out there the entire night and watched. And Wayne Howell, who was one of the NBC announcers, had a disc jockey program, and he was on the air. And even though there weren't any turntables there were three people there. The talent, which was Wayne Howell, the director, who was a man named Michael Klepper, and the engineer. I don't recall his name, but the engineer sat there with two pots, two volume controls, one to control the volume of Wayne Howell's microphone, and the other pot was coming from the studio, which was feeding all of the programming material, the music, whatever else, coming in there, and this engineer was mixing that. And they had a couple of those great old, if you remember the Ampex 601 tape recorders that came in like a tan suitcase, they made the 622 speakers. It had an amplifier in it. God, those things sounded great. And they had a couple of those there as the monitors. And I was absolutely fascinated. I stood out there and watched for hours. Well, the director, my friends had finally come back, and the director said to me, he said, you want to be a disc jockey when you grow up? And I was kind of shy and just shrugged, and my friend said, yeah, tell him, yeah, Jeff. So I said, yeah. So he said, when you have a day off from school, he said, we're up on the 8th floor of the RCA building, NBC Studios. He said, you come on up. So I think it was a Jewish holiday. I think it was Purim, which I didn't celebrate. I would normally maybe take a day off from school, but I took the day off from school and went up to the 8th floor, and there I am standing in the hallway of the 8th floor of NBC Studios in the RCA building. And at the end of the hallway is the famous Studio 8H, which was when the NBC Studios were built, when the RCA building was built in the 1930s. This Studio 8H was built for Arturo Toscanini and the NBC Symphony Orchestra. I believe it was 3 stories tall. So it was the largest studio of the NBC Studios. And I'm standing there, and all of a sudden, out of the elevator comes Michael Klepper, the director, and the disc jockey, who he was going to direct, Art Ford. Art Ford was famous in the world of New York disc jockeys. Art Ford was the first all-night milkman on the Milkman's Matinee on WNEW radio, the first all-night disc jockey. So he was now on WNBC radio, and I think he was working a split shift. I think he worked from maybe 10 to 12, and then in the afternoon. So anyway, Michael Klepper immediately recognized me. He said, "Hey, how are you?" And he says, "Come with us." So at the time, WNBC they usually broadcast from what they call a showcase studio, which I believe was on the 5th floor. And after you walked from the elevator bank, there was this showcase studio, glass enclosed studio that people can watch, and it was part of the NBC tour. Well, they were rebuilding that. So they were working temporarily in one of the old radio studios, Studio 8E. And it was a relatively small studio. The control room was absolutely tiny, but there was the engineer's position. And then right behind the engineer's position was a tall desk. That's where the director sat. And then in the studio, there were 3 desks. There was a main desk, and they all used the RCA 77s, 77DXs. And that was a on the main disc jockey desk, it was the RCA 77 was hanging from a boom microphone stand, and the other two desks were smaller desks in the corner, and they had RCA 77s just on desk stands. And the two desks were, the local newsman would come in on the half hour and read the news, and then every half hour, an NBC announcer would stroll in on the other desk, and he would say, WNBC, AM and FM, New York. And that's what he would do, and then sign the log and move on to his next assignment. But I kept going up there, and I was invited to come as often as I wished to, and I did. And I think I met most, if not all, of the NBC announcers. And so many people, and I learned so much from watching the operation that when we moved into our new home and I built my radio station, I bought a Lafayette phono oscillator, which was basically a little AM transmitter. And I put it together, and I found an empty dial position, I think at 1160 on the dial. And I called my little radio station WCBC, the Continental Broadcasting Company. And since I had been going to WNBC so often, I learned all of the NBC cues. So I affiliated my WCBC radio with the NBC radio network because I was much quicker with my hand on the potentiometer on the volume control to bring up things, and I could time. I had a clock in my room that was timed to the exact second. By the way, at the NBC studios, this was great. They had little GE clocks in the studios. They were not the Western Electric things I later saw at other stations. But a man would walk around all of the NBC studios with a chronometer, I think a naval chronometer, and he would make sure all the clocks were timed to the exact second. And I saw this man a number of times while I was up there. But since these were electric clocks, they were pretty much on time. But anyway, I affiliated my little radio station at home with NBC so I could carry the news. And they had a newscast in the morning. It was the NBC World News Roundup. And the cues were just really odd, but I knew all of the timings, and I could hit them all. Well, every time I visited WNBC, they let me go home with an armful of transcriptions. The transcriptions were basically the commercials that came on records. They call these records transcriptions. So I walked home with them. I still have the collection. I always loved radio commercials. To this day, I love good creative commercials. So I would run these commercials on my station at home, even though I wasn't getting paid for anything. But I love the sound of them. I love the jingles. I love the creativity. So it was all, to make the station sound real. And during the NBC World News Roundup, they broke at, really odd times. So I would run the commercial. I'd have a little thing to say in there and pick the Morgan Beatty back up and turn up the pot and have it. But anyway, it was I had a programming schedule on my station. I was just looking at an old Lafayette radio catalog last night and saw the little console that I used, which was sold for $4.95, and it had 4 volume controls on it. It was run with a 9-volt battery, and my first job after high school was at the E.J. Corvette department store in the juvenile furniture department. Well, while I was there, I used my employee discount to buy a great stereo system. And man, I spent my money on that thing. I bought a Fisher X1000 integrated amplifier. Now, this Fisher X1000 was actually a 3-channel amplifier. And what I would do is I would feed the left channel directly into my little transmitter. the right channel would remain a monitor in the family room, and the center channel would come back and feed my headphones, my little monitor that was actually one of these ceiling speakers that I put into a straw wastebasket next to my position where I sat, and at my desk I would and it would also run a couple of VU meters I had next to my little console there. But also, when I was at WNBC looking in there, I said, this is amazing. When they turned on the microphone for the announcer or the disc jockey, the speakers would mute, the monitors would mute. But they, of course, had all of these relays in the console that would make that work. So I figured a way to make it work in my old little radio station, and I had a desk, and I got a knife switch. You remember what the knife switches looked like? They were used for experimental things. Well, it had two things on there, two contacts. And one contact, when the contact was made, it would turn on the speaker. When the other contact was made, it would short my microphone. So when my microphone was on, the speaker was off, and when the microphone was shorted, the speaker was on. So it was great. It was right under my right on the bottom of my desk. I had it scotch taped to the bottom of the desk. So it was really something. We had one record player. It was a Webcore record player, and I needed two turntables. So that was one turntable. The other one was I found someone throwing away a kiddie phonograph in the neighborhood, and I took it and mounted it on, I think it was a Reco-Cut bass, turntable bass, and it worked there, and I needed an arm. So I took the kiddie arm, the kiddie record player arm, and attached a paint stirring stick, glued that to the top of it, and just used the pivot of the arm of the kiddie record player, and glued an static cartridge on there so I could play 16-inch transcriptions on it, which was part of my take from going to WNBC. I would come home with some transcriptions, and some of them were 16 inches. So I was able to play those. And it came in handy, too, because on those 16-inch transcriptions sometimes had full 15-minute shows, so I could take a break from my disc jockey endeavors at home and do whatever I was going to do, grab a quick bite to eat or whatever. But I remained pretty true to keeping this up. Well, let me take a step back a little bit. From when I was about 11 or 12 years old, I always had this interest in radio and electronics and cameras and projectors and things. And I had a great uncle. My Uncle Al would come over with his wife and children, and he had movies that he recorded and let me run the projector. And he saw my interest in this thing, and he gave me his Webcore tape recorder when I was about 11 years old. This thing weighed a ton. And that was really the beginning. And I did little radio shows on it. I had friends over. We did, you can imagine what 11 or 12-year-old kid would do. And that's what we did. And I think I still have some of these old tapes as well. But had a great time, learned a lot. And again, that was the beginning of recording and communicating.
I want to ask you something about the early days with the radio station. You mentioned that you had all the WNBC cues. Mm-hmm. Explain what a cue is. What did that mean? How did that help you run the station?
Well, at a certain time, let's say, I think the NBC World News Roundup started at 7:30 in the morning, but at an exact time, it was something like 7:33 and 20 seconds. They would break for a commercial. And these were exact times. And I said they were odd. They were just odd times, but they were holy. And they kept by these things. So I learned all of these cues. And also, since I was going up there, and they told me what to say, they said, if anybody asks you any questions, because here I was, a 15-year-old kid going up to the NBC studios, and what's this kid doing up there? He said, just tell him you're in local radio. So I used that, and I just looked like I knew where I was going. And that was it. But I went up on weekends to watch Monitor, the NBC great radio show they had, which was on the network. And that was amazing. That was done around the corner from Studio 8E, and I think it was Studio 8. They had studios A, B, and C, and it was a different layout, much larger than this little Studio 8E. And in there, they had a master control room, and there was this big old RCA turntable, and on it was a 16-inch transcription that would run constantly, and it was the Monitor beacon that they can always pot up. They can always turn the volume up whenever they needed it, and it just ran. That was in the main control room. Then just below that, there was a long room, and in there were 3 directors for the NBC Monitor show. Opposite these 3 directors was another engineer who would actually have the turntables and run the music that was used in the program. And then at the end of this long room was a booth, and in the booth was the talent, the host of NBC Monitor. So it was all like clockwork. And I learned all of these cues so I could run Monitor on weekends on my own little WCBC radio station. And it was just great. It was great practice.
And out of high school, you got your first broadcasting real job, right?
I did. I left the EJ Corvette department store. It was before Christmas, and I applied for a job at was really the largest station on Long Island, WHLI, the voice of Long Island. And they were kind of a long hair music station. They played beautiful music. They played some pop music, and they ran the station almost like a network. And I was hired to work in the music library, and it was an extensive music library. And I worked there, pulled records. They eventually gave me the responsibility of starting to program a show. All of the programs had names. Forget what the morning show was called. But they had light classics that would come on at 11. It was called Music Hall. They had Broadway music. It would come on at 3:30, and then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there was a show that came on called Music at the Country Club. And Music at the Country Club was my kind of music. And they gave me the responsibility of starting to program this thing. Well, it became so popular, and they got so many nice comments from it, that even though it was the same, it was the kind of music they had programmed, but I guess I added a little bit more freshness to it and widened the number of artists that were used. But it became so popular that they expanded the hours of this program. So I was programming, I guess, a couple of hours a day, but still doing the pulling of the records and things. While I was at the station, they would not consider using me as a voice on the station. All of their voices were these announcers, and I didn't have the pipes. But someone told me about, in the same town in Hempstead was Hofstra University, and Hofstra had a radio station. Somebody told me about it, and I went there, and they gave me a job. They gave me a job to be on, to be on the air, even though I didn't attend Hofstra University. So I had a show on Sunday afternoon, and it was great practice at a real radio station with a real console. And Jeff Krause was the general manager back then. Wonderful guy. And I then started doing more programs there. I had at least 3 different programs on the radio station. And then on weekends, I would work at a station that was actually owned by the New York Herald Tribune. The man who owned the Herald Tribune was a man named John Hay Whitney. And he lived on this vast estate near Manhasset, Long Island, on the North Shore, and that's where the transmitter was. Well, when the station first went on the air, they splashed it. There was a brand new shopping mall in Garden City called Roosevelt Field. And on the concourse level, on the lower level, they built this WFYI, the Station for Your Information. And it was built like a network. And I remember going down there as a teenager and watching there, and it was just it was a vast, just wonderful operation. Well, apparently they couldn't make any money with it, so they closed it up and moved everything up to the transmitter site, and that's where they operated from the transmitter building. Well, I was hired to be on that station on weekends, and I was a weekend man there, and that too was great experience. And from there, the man who was Andy Benedict, who hired me, the program director, moved on to another station, which was owned by the old actor Eddie Bracken. He owned a station, WBIC in Islip, New York, at 540 on the dial. Great dial position. And they were a daytime station, and he asked me if I would like to work there full-time and have a show, and I said, yeah. So I left my job as in the music department of WHLI and started working at WBIC. WBIC, and I guess this was Eddie Bracken's suggestion, but every day when they would sign off the air, they would play Jan Pierce singing The Bluebird of Happiness. That was their sign-off music. So it was a little unusual. But anyway, I had the mid-morning show, and then I got my draft notice. I was to be inducted into the Army.
And back to WBIC for a second.
Yeah.
Explain real briefly what a daytime station is as opposed to...
A daytime station, stations are allocated, all stations, by the FCC, and where they can operate, what their power has to be, what their directional pattern is so they don't interfere with other stations on the same dial position or a close dial position. So apparently WBIC was protecting another, I'm not sure if there was a clear channel station, but they had to protect another station that was perhaps a 24-hour station. Let me take a step back. At night, AM radio signals bounce off the ionosphere. And because of that, you can hear clear channel stations for 37, 40 states because the signal, rather than during the daytime almost being a straight shot of where your radio is within a certain radius, the signal actually bounces off the ionosphere. It goes into the sky and comes back down like an umbrella, so you can pick up these long stations. So anyway, a daytime station would have to protect another station on that dial position and sign off at sunset and then sign back on at sunrise. So that's what this WBIC radio station was.
And then Uncle Sam came calling.
Uncle Sam came calling. And I went into basic training. This was January of 1966. And I remembered during my time at WHLI, President Johnson was giving a talk, I think it was 1965, And I went into the control room where he was giving a speech, and I knew right then that my number was going to come up, because the war, the Vietnam War, had gotten so bad that they were heavily drafting people. And I knew I was going to go. But anyway, when I got my notice, I went in early January of 1966 and took a troop train and landed at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, just outside of Columbia, South Carolina. Went through the reception station, which I thought was the worst experience of my life, and then went into basic training, which seemed like a holiday from the reception station. But anyway, it was during my time going through basic training at Fort Jackson that I wrote a letter to Washington, to no one in particular, and I addressed the letter to Armed Forces Press, Radio, and Television, Washington, D.C. And somehow it got to people, and I put down my experience and my interest in radio, and I had addressed it to Armed Forces Press, Radio, and Television. And actually, a couple of weeks later, I received a reply from a chief warrant officer who said, "We will consider your request." I said, "Great." Meantime, I was called out of my unit one day to Army Intelligence, and they said, according to tests that you took when you first entered, we want to send you to officer candidate school following basic training to work in Army Intelligence as an image interpreter. So I had very little to say. He wanted to know what college I attended, and I said I'm a high school graduate. So he took his eraser and erased it. He says, "You can go back to your unit." And when I went back to my unit, and this was the same day, there was a letter waiting for me from a colonel in Washington, D.C., who said, "We have considered your request for Armed Forces Radio, and following your basic training at Fort Jackson, you'll be given a 2-week leave to return to Fort Jackson in Headquarters Company to work at the Public Information Office as a 71R20. That's a military MOS, military occupational specialty of 71R20, broadcast specialist." So I was elated. And following basic, I went back to Fort Jackson, worked at the Public Information Office my first day there. They said, "Here, take this camera crew and go out and film a movie." And I said, "About what?" And they said, "I don't know." Well, it wasn't my cup of tea. I really never did any announcing while I was a broadcast specialist, but just hung around the information office. I did some reporting. There were some journalists in there. And there was a talent show coming up on Post that was in the Post newspaper. And my talent was lip-syncing records. I lip-sync records practically all my life. I loved doing that. They were mostly Stan Freberg records. So I went up to New York. I had a few days off, came back with my Stan Freberg tapes, and entered the contest, and I won the contest. I won the talent show, and they sent me to the Third Army talent contest. Now, the Third Army is made up of all of the military Army installations in the 7 southeastern states, and this was held at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So I did that, and they decided not to take me on tour after the contest was over with some of the other contestants from the talent show. So I went back to Fort Jackson, and at Fort Jackson was the Third Army Soldier Show based in Atlanta at Fort McPherson. And what they did is they put on a full-blown Broadway production that was absolutely astounding. I couldn't believe what I saw. They were just great. Well, the lady who goaded me from the service club, who liked what I did and said, "I've got to introduce you to the director of the show, Mr. Gil Gross. So I met Gil Gross, who's directing the show, and did my lip sync for him. And he said, "We want you in Atlanta. We want to put you in the show." So I said, "Great." So I was supposed to go to Atlanta for 90 days. And I was told when I got to Atlanta, if they like you, they'll keep you here. Well, I stayed for the rest of my year and a half in service at Fort McPherson in Atlanta in the Third Army Soldier Show, and I not only did I only did the lip sync in the very first show I was in. After that, they had me singing and dancing in various productions, and they were just really, really good. There wasn't enough time for me to be in the final show. It was usually a 3-month operation where they would rehearse for a month and a half and then take it on the road being all of the military installations in the Southeast and some ROTC colleges. So it was November of 1967 that they said, "Go make yourself useful, find something to do." So I applied for a job at what was my favorite radio station in Atlanta, the station I listened to most, which was WKXI, which was the FM station of WQXI. And they played the music that I liked, mixed in with a little bit of soft rock, and they had business news. And I really enjoyed it. I went out and went to Muse's men's shop and bought a brand new double-breasted blue pinstripe suit. And a friend of mine, Malcolm McLeod, loaned me his polka dot blue with white polka dot tie. And I applied for a job at WKXI. And I had heard her on the air, and she was the lady who her official title was administrative assistant, but she pretty much ran the station, Sylvia Clark. And I had my interview with Sylvia, and then she introduced me to Kent Burkhart, and I met with him, and that was the beginning. That was the beginning of my time at WKXI. My first day on the air was Thanksgiving Day of 1967. And I was taught to use the console and the turntables by Bonnie Pett, who was just one of the record spinners. They had record spinners there at the times when live announcers were not on the air. So I did that. My shift was from 1 p.m. to 7 p.m., 6 hours on the air, 6 days a week, and learned a good bit about business news, which was, I think the station was a little bit ahead of its time. It's almost like commercials, like good commercials. When I say I loved good creative commercials or good jingles, really some of the best music and a comedy, good writing goes into a commercial. Here it is, it's on the air for 30 or 60 seconds, and they have to cram all this stuff in and yet give the information. But the creativity that went into it was absolutely astounding. And I think business news is the same thing. You're kind of setting the trend of what real news is going to be, because things happen in business that will affect the economy and what people's tastes are and what's coming out, what's new. So you're kind of looking a few days, a few weeks, a few months ahead of what's really going to happen. So I embraced the business news and, of course, played the music. And it was my birthday, April 4th, 1968, when I would get off the air at 7 p.m., there were usually a few things for me to record, some commercials, local commercials that would air on the station. So I got off the air at 7 p.m. on my birthday, April 4th of 1968, and went back into the little production room in the back, and I could hear the teletype machine going nuts. the bells were ringing, and I looked in there, and it had just mentioned that Martin Luther King was just assassinated. And I turned on the TV in the little production room in the back, and I said, even though the station was not a news station, I went back into the FM studio, because back then there was not an announcer. At 7 p.m., a record spinner took over who just played the records and ran pre-recorded business reports and weather reports and so forth. And I broke in live and gave the bulletin on the air. And it was quite a momentous day. I was going to go out that night and have a steak dinner to celebrate my birthday, but didn't do it. Didn't do it after that. It was quite a night.
So the station was integrating music programming with business news.
Exactly.
How did that work? And what was your job in the afternoon? How did you tie those things together?
In our building at 2970 Peachtree Road was a brokerage firm. It was originally Courts and Company, became Robinson Humphrey. And what we would do is get local stock quotes from them for local companies. Back then, the national wires really didn't concentrate too much other than giving some business news stories and the Dow Jones averages. That was pretty much it. But for local, we had to get that ourselves. So we got local quotes. We gave each half hour on WKXI, and we did stories, business stories. Sometimes they came from the wire, and sometimes we just spoke with local people, and it was different, interesting.
Were you writing the copy, or did you have news people in the building too?
No, we did it ourselves. We put it together. But again, it was mostly wire copy for the national stories. For the local things, we would have people in who we would interview. And one time I actually interviewed Stan Freberg. He was coming to Atlanta to address the I think it was Terminix. He was going to handle the account. And what they were going to do, they were meeting at the Hyatt Regency downtown and had all of the exterminators there in the room. And Freberg was going to give his presentation. And I actually sat in on it and saw his presentation, and then had the opportunity to interview him for half an hour afterward. Told him what he meant to my life, which was what I really wanted to do. Without him, I don't know where I would be. But bottom line was, I said, if you could have one account, what would it be? He said, the country. And he actually wound up doing a series of radio commercials to try to end the Vietnam War after that. And I have those spots that he did. I think it was a series of 3 or 4 different commercials that he did. That was one of the people interviewed. But they were interesting people that came through. I remember the man who had Penthouse Magazine. It was, I forgot what his name was. But when Penthouse was first starting, he came to the station, and I interviewed him. I have a photograph of me and, gosh, I can't think. Oh, Bob Guccione. Yeah, Bob Guccione. And, of course, the big thing was, well, how are you, Playboy's the big player on the block, and how are you going to do this? And he had a lot of confidence, and we aired it, and we put it on the air. There were a lot of different people who came through. And
it sounds like a really interesting format, and I'm still curious as what a typical hour looked like, because you were able to stop down and actually do a half-hour interview, and yet you were also playing music.
Yeah, well, the business reports actually took no more than a couple of minutes. So we would obviously edit them and just use, and if it was a long interview and it warranted a few different reports, we would do that. I think the Stan Freberg thing was maybe 2 or 3 different things, 2 or 3 different reports, and it would lean on one aspect of it, for that particular report for the 2 or 3 minutes, whatever it was.
So briefly lay out a typical hour. If you're in there from 1 to 7, what would the 2 to 3 hour look like in terms of segments?
Well, starting at 1 o'clock, 1 o'clock to about 3:30, 4 o'clock, it would be pretty easy. After that, there was more. There would be business news reports. I believe we did those at 15 and 45 minutes after the hour. But it was later in the afternoon that we would incorporate some news reports as well, and we would read that. That was basically wire copy that we would just read. And that would be at, I forget if it was on the hour, half hour, whatever we did, but we would keep people informed. Traffic was not a big thing back then. We didn't have traffic reports, but we would do the news and the weather and the business reports, and everything else was the music. And we had these cute little, we were using the Pam's jingle package. It was called the Smart Set back then, and it was very integral to the sound of the radio station. And it was just a very comfortable, nice sound. And I still hear from people who remember it and think fondly of it.
So it was basically disc jockeying, playing records, talking between the songs, playing commercials.
No, well, we were not personalities. Everything we did was read, but the way it was read was not. It was very casual. It was very casual. As a matter of fact, it was in late, I believe it was sometime in 1968, where I took over the morning shift. Went from 1 to 7 in the afternoon and then did mornings. And I guess that was probably from 6 to 12, 6 a.m. to 12 noon. And then after that, in early 1969, I was made the operations manager of the station. Sylvia Clark had moved on to be the music director of WQXI radio, AM. And so I moved into her position as the operations manager of the radio station, which gave me the hiring and firing duties of the station. And my thought in hiring people were to make sure they sounded good. They didn't sound like stentorian announcers. I wanted real voices, good people. And it was during that time when the vice mayor, what they call him the night mayor of Atlanta, came up to the station. It was Maynard Jackson, and it was the first time I met him. And we had a nice conversation, and I actually offered him a job. I said, "You sound great." I said, "You're exactly the kind of voice I'm looking for to be on the air." And we both had a good laugh about it. And I said, "Well, listen," I said, if this vice mayor thing doesn't work out, I said, "Please come see me," and I'd love to. And it turned out that I would run into Maynard Jackson for years and years after that, and every time we did, we knew each other. And as a matter of fact, the last time I saw him was shortly before his passing. We had seen each other waiting in a security line at the airport back then, which was an airport of his doing, which I'll get to later in my story. But he had a great sound. He had a wonderful voice and a wonderful way about him, and that was the kind of person I wanted to be on the air to represent the station, who could take the written word and make it their own. And that's what it was all about.
It sounds like you had a really clear mission for the radio station for
Yeah.
yourself. Who were you learning from? Who were the people you were looking to? Who was managing the station at the time? Who owned it? I mean, where did
Yeah.
this all come from?
Yeah. Well, it was really, to me, everything came down from Kent Burkhardt. He would, I think he surrounded himself with wonderful people who knew programming. And we kept fine-tuning this black box of what music we would play and how much of it and this and that. And it was really, I loved working with these people. There was Ken Dow was one of the people at the station.
What was Kent's position, Kent Burkhardt?
Kent Burkhardt was the general manager.
And Ken Dow was?
Ken Dow was, I think he came in, he might have been a consultant, I don't know if he was with the radio station. There was another man as well, George Burns, who was also another man, and he would work with the station, and how much of the pop music or the hits we would be playing with the album music. And by album music, I'm talking about Sinatra and artists, pop music artists like that, more the standards. And we would mix the two, and it worked. The station had a great sound. WKXI, which then became WQXI FM, was let's see, how can I say this? We were one of the last stations to go stereo in Atlanta. We were a mono signal. And what I learned about FM is the wrong system was chosen for FM stereo in the United States. It was FM multiplex, which was invented by Zenith, and people were saying that's not the right system because it takes too much of the sound, the loudness away from the basic FM signal. So by us being mono, we and there was another FM station in Atlanta, WBIE FM, which was also mono. They played country music, but we were the two loudest signals in Atlanta because we were mono. And we were using on the air the old Quixie AM console, which was goosed up and just had this fabulous sound to it. Just wonderful. I think it was an old tube console. But it just had a great sound, and the sound just leaped out of the radio, and it was just wonderful, and it was such a present, wonderful sound. So everything on the station just sounded great. Well, it was time for us to go stereo. We went stereo, and it was like, to me, it was like throwing a wet blanket over the sound. We lost that spark. But I worked with Tom Giglio in engineering and Richard Mertz in engineering, and we kept playing with the compression. We were using CBS Audimax and Volumax and kept playing with it. I wanted us to have a little bit more dynamic range on the air, but keep the loudness. Well, the two didn't coexist. You had to be one or the other. So the station still had a good sound. When we went stereo, I was really adamant about everything we played on the air being stereo. And there were a lot of records we played that weren't stereo. And in a number of occasions, the record people really cooperated with us and gave us dubs off master tapes. And I remember we had the dub of a master tape of Elvis doing Suspicious Minds because it was never put out in stereo. And so somewhere there's a stereo tape struck off the master that we played on the air of that. But that was just one one of the things, and I was adamant about the quality of everything on the air being sounding good in mono as well as stereo. And you're dealing with something called phasing back then. And when we put an oscilloscope in the studio, this is when the station we went automated. And when we went automated, everything was on tape. And in tape, if the tape is not exactly aligned to the playback head from how it was recorded, the sound in mono would sound like that. It would have a muffled, terrible sound. So in order to do that, we checked every tape cartridge we used for everything on an oscilloscope and put a tone through it and made sure that was exactly, every tape cartridge was in phase. So everything that was aired on the station was as perfect as it could be technically. And we kept up and kept fine-tuning our black box of programming and kept it up. We held our own. It was during this time in the early 1970s that FM was starting to get into more automobiles, and they called it FM penetration. How many people had FM radios? And FM was starting to pull numbers, was starting to get ratings. So the FM property was becoming more valuable. And during our automated days, we unfortunately had to cut staff tremendously, and there were basically 3 people at the radio station. It was me as operations manager, the morning man, who was Bob Carr, and my secretary. And Bob Carr came in the morning, and basically what he did was set up the tapes for the day and then read news and put his newscast into a tape machine which would call for it. So he didn't really have to read it live on the air. He just stuck it in a machine which called for it. So Bob had extra time on his hands, and he became Willis the Guard for WQXI AM for Gary McKee, and became just a wonderful character. And his career took off from there. Anyway, with the FM station being more of a valuable property, they felt at some point in 1974 where they needed to rock what they call rock the FM. It needed to go really mainstream and not do this sort of easy rock thing that normal FM stations back then would be doing. So they didn't think I was part of that picture. So I was let go, and it was the only time in my life I was ever let go from anything. But I was let go from the station in June or May or June of '74, and I had walked back into my office, and Kent Burkhart, by the way, was no longer at WQXI and WQXI FM or Pacific and Southern Broadcasting, and he was an independent consultant for many stations. And when I walked back into my office, my phone rang, and it was Kent Burkhart, who knew I had been let go, and said, "Don't worry about a thing." He said, "I'm going to be working with WKLS, which was another FM station in Atlanta, which at the time was playing beautiful music." And he said, "And we're going to be rocking that one, and I want you to be the morning man, a personality," which I had never done in Atlanta. On my my days on WQXI FM, I was a friendly voice. I was a guy in the radio. And I said, "You sure?" I said, "You want me as a disc jockey, morning man?" He says, "You'll kill him, Tiger. You'll be great." So,
I want to stop you there for
Yeah,
a second
please.
because I want to because I love this part of the story, and especially thinking back on the history of radio. Here's a station that decided to rock the radio station, and you were let go immediately to jump across town to what became the number one rock station.
yeah.
Right. But I have a couple of quick questions about the WKXI, WQXI experience before we move on. One, they changed the call letters
Right.
to WQXI FM. What was the thinking behind that?
The thinking behind it, I don't know. I don't know. The station is actually licensed not to Atlanta, but to Smyrna, Georgia. So that's why to this day, when you hear the hourly legal call letters on the air, it says Smyrna, Atlanta. Well, it was a fight to get Atlanta to mention with Smyrna because it used to be just Smyrna. But I remember our ID on the hour was done by Mark Van Brooks, who was a WQXI AM newsman. Great voice, and he gave the what I call the call of the hunt ID on the hour of WKXI. And I remember when we switched, and we did these little teasers that said from K to Q, that's all we'll do, but nothing else is changing. So that was the change from WKXI to WQXI FM. Also, with the station being licensed to Smyrna, and me being the operations manager, they had what they called is it called community ascertainment. Every radio station has that because the station is licensed to that particular city, and the station has to do something for the city. So here I was named the new operations manager, and I had to go out and interview what they called community leaders in Smyrna. And this was back around 1969, 1970. And it was an eye-opener. It was good to get out, talk with people, find out what their problems were. I don't know if anything was ever solved with what they told me, but we turned it in and wrote reports and all of that. But
The other question I had too is, as FM was beginning to become more popular and generate more revenue, that radio station actually transitioned from being more live to automated. What was the thinking there?
Well,
and
in my days there, when I left in 74, it was fully automated. 77, it was fully automated. No, I left, I'm sorry, in 74. We became really the envy of station owners. And I can't tell you how many station owners called to see our operation, talk with me, see what we did, and how it was done. Back then, the station was a veritable cash register. With 3 employees, they were using the sales department. When I originally started, there were a couple of salespeople just for the FM station. Well, they decided to consolidate the sales department and have sales AM sell the AM and FM stations, and they were just a great sales staff. And the station was making back then 6 figures a month, and the cost to operate the thing was basically a jukebox. We tried in the operation of the radio station to keep it the same sound, the same. It was never, as I said, it was never a personality station, but it had the same sound when we were live and when we were automated. It's hard to tell the difference. So that was good, but the station needed to come out front. They needed to make it really, they had a wonderful property there to do. And they didn't need to make it rock, and they did need to do something. So as I look back on it, I think it was a proper move for them to do.
And also, after Kent Burkhart left, he was kind of your mentor.
Oh, yeah.
Back then. Who filled those shoes after he had left the station? Who were you learning from, or who was there that was making creative decisions that you appreciated?
Really, there was. I don't think there was that much of a hands-on programming decisions made after he left. A lot of it was just sort of, we just kept running and with what we had. I can't really think of anyone that had to do with the programming after he left. And as I said, he's always surrounded himself with great people, and he did a lot of research and just had a wonderful sense about the business. And
so he called you to let you know that he was going to be involved in a new radio station, WKLS.
Yeah, in Atlanta, right? Yeah.
So talk about that.
Well, that was brand new. Barry Chase, who used to be one of the disc jockeys on WQXI AM, was going to be the program director at WKLS, and I was morning man, and a number of the people from the radio station was going to be album rock were from the Georgia State radio station, which had a lot of experience playing album rock. I didn't at all. I hardly knew the artists. So I had a learning curve, but I loved it. And I'll tell you what happened. For the first couple of weeks on the air, they said, play whatever you want. So I thought I died and went to heaven. I came in every day with my record bag filled with Mel Torme and Lena Horne and Basie, and I'm playing this stuff. And I'll tell you, after about a week, I said, I can't take another minute of this stuff. I was sick of my own music. I was tired of it. And when we started playing the Doobie Brothers and the Rolling Stones, it was like a breath of fresh air. And I think back at that because I've had thoughts many times of playing the music of my passion, but I said, what if I get tired of it? What if I get sick of it again? So I really never did it, but I still love my standard music. But I learned a lot being at the radio station and got a great joy and appreciation of the music and loved it. And I remember it was supposed to be the first day, I was supposed to sign on 96 Rock WKLS at 6 in the morning on a certain date. I think it was June of 1974, and they couldn't wait. They signed it on at midnight, the midnight, 6 hours before. But I'll never forget taking a shower that morning, and in the shower, I had the radio playing, and they were playing the Doobie Brothers' Black Water. And I said, what a great record. This is so fresh and new. To me, I never heard it before. So this was what I was in for. And I really enjoyed my time at the station. People said I didn't sound like your typical rock jock on the air, and I wasn't. I was kind of this middle-of-the-road guy on the air in the morning, laid-back Lenny, whoever in the morning, and just did things and communicated with people in a very natural way. No put-ons, no crazy things. We had no money at the station for promotions, and I remember WQXI giving away cars and houses, and we had nothing. We had no money. And we were at the Atlanta Townhouse, which was this kind of a second-rate hotel. The building is still there at the corner of 10th Street and the Expressway. It's now, I think, either a dorm or a medical center. But the station, the glass in front of the console faced into the hallway, and in there, the hallway was a Coke machine and an ice machine, and all I could think of giving away was if people want to come up for the weekend and fill up their ice chest from the ice machine, I would award that to the 96th caller. And that was one of the prizes we give away. Finally, I think it bounced off a truck, but somebody had a box of FM converters. And FM converters back then, because most cars were not equipped with FM radios, they had AM radios. These FM converters would somehow hook up to your AM radio in the car, and you could pick up FM stations. So we got a box of FM converters, and we gave those away on the air. And then the station got up to speed and started, working with advertisers and giving away some decent prizes for things. But there was a love at the station. Also, very early on, we got involved with saving the Fox Theater. That was very early on in the when 96 Rock first signed on the air. We had a little trailer that got a derrick and moved it up to the roof of the Atlanta Townhouse Hotel, where people could see it on the expressway. And the DJ who came on at 10 o'clock, Dean Clark, lived up there during the Save the Fox thing. Got a lot of publicity, got a lot of notice, and a big splash. And the station got up to speed very, very quickly.
And who was the general manager? Because Barry Chase didn't stay for a super long time, as I remembered.
No, the general manager was a man named Don Waterman, and he was there when the station was a beautiful music station. And he kind of rolled with the punches of us now being a rock station. He had a girlfriend who he wound up marrying, lovely girl, lovely lady, but he got a phone number that he got especially for her, and the last four digits spelled LOVE. Well, the station took over that phone number, and we called it the Love Line, and people would call in and request songs on the Love Line for 96 Rock. We did whatever we could. I mean, it was basically, it was baling wire and Scotch tape. And
how was Kent Burkhardt involved?
Kent Burkhardt worked with Lee Abrams. It was Burkhardt Abrams. They were the consultants to the radio station, and Lee Abrams had done extensive research on this kind of music, how people would enjoy it. They laid out the rules. Basically, the number one rule was music respect. That was number one. And that's the mantra of 96 Rock when it first started, music respect. And they came up with a clock of what types of songs would go in different order, and it worked. When we first signed on the air, we were actually more pop than what the station wound up being. We were playing. I think when the station first signed on the air, we were playing Olivia Newton-John singing "I Honestly Love You." That was part of the album rock format, and that sort of slipped away, and it became much more of an album rock station. The music that I played in the morning was a bit easier than what was played during the rest of the day, and they gave me leeway, although I didn't get into Sinatra and bassy in the morning. I played a little bit more, perhaps Joni Mitchell, than would be heard for the rest of the day. But it was a little bit softer.
And what defines some of the rules under the category of music respect? I mean, what different things did you do to be true to that?
Anything, really, there were no rules beyond that. It was just those two words, music respect, and you make it up from there. And when you're playing things, when you talk about artists, there was a respect, a respectability, a respect about the artist, about the song. Anything you spoke about was positive and respectful. That's all I can think of.
There are in some of the early radio stations, part of the music respect meant that you did not talk when the music was playing. Was that something that you guys lived by?
Oh, yeah. We didn't speak over any of the records. There was no talk up to the vocal. No, it was pure from beginning to end of any song we played. One day I went on the air, and part of what I did in the morning, I actually had to read some news in the morning, and many times the teletype machine or the news wire, somebody would forget to put paper in it, so I didn't have anything to read in the morning. So I would pick up something from there called Earth News, which was just funny things. I'd pick it up and read it, and sometimes it would strike me funny and read, and I couldn't stop laughing, but that was just part of it. But
so as the station evolved, who else got involved? What other programming people were there? What other air staff came in, and how did the station evolve and change?
Well, when we signed on as 96 Rock, it was 96 Rock, and everybody on there, the staff, all of the talent was into it. There was really no one left over from the old days of the old WKLS. We were in there to rock, and we were in there to play that music, have the music respect, and become a 96 Rock an entity in Atlanta radio of album rock music, and do it very cleanly, professionally, and I really can't think of anything else. It was just,
and that was a huge transition from the old WKLS.
Oh yeah,
which
yeah.
Beautiful music means what kind of songs?
Well, you would have Frank Chaxfield and his orchestra, or Mantovani, perhaps mixed in with some Peter Nero playing the piano, Rosemary Clooney, Sinatra. You'd have that sort of middle of the road, pretty music, background music. But there was one station in Atlanta back then, Peach, WPCH, which was programmed to do beautiful music, and they knocked the socks off of just about everybody in town. They did it so well, and it was so well programmed and presented that it was a great success, great radio success.
And when WKLS changed from the Mantovani to the rock, was there a reaction in the community? Did you guys hear from people who
again, we had that 2-week transition where you could play whatever you want on the radio, and I think that either chased away a lot of people, or they knew they knew change was in town. I mean, if I was playing Mel Torme, Dean Clark, who would be coming after me, he's going to be playing the music that would probably start being 96 Rocks. I mean, it was catch as catch can. In for this 2-week period, so that was the transition.
As the station grew, who else came into the mix? Who else was involved? Burkhart Douglas was there. Burkhart Abrams.
Yeah.
who were your program directors at the time that you were there? Was Barry Chase?
Yeah, Barry Chase was let go. I think he had disagreements, I think, with the general manager, with Don Waterman, and then let's see, Roger. I can't remember his last name. Another program director came in. Roger, I can't remember his last name. Can't think of his last name. But the station just kind of got its legs, and had more confidence in itself, and
rating successes.
Yeah. The ratings started coming. Ratings started coming, and I think the audience realized we were serious about it, really into it, and I think it was audience respect, really, for the music, and I think it came from the music respect that the people at the station had for the product that was on the air.
And as you're doing that, you're starting to get interested again in commercial work.
I was right for years, even my years at WQXI FM. I always loved commercials and wanted to be the voice on different things. And as I was there, it was probably around 1973, 74, when I developed a little bit a different style, and just kind of a more contemporary style in speaking. Commercials, voiceover, I really wanted to get involved in that, always did. And going back to WQXI FM, one thing I forgot to mention, with the station being automated, that left a lot of time to not have to sit and spin records. So that time was used mostly. WQXI, the sales department, which worked for AM and FM, hired a creative man, a fellow named Larry Larson. Larry was hired to come up with some creativity so the salespeople could go out and find new clients. So Larry would go along and hear the story and come up with some copy. Well, Larry and I hit it off. They had this small production studio in the back. There were two production studios in the back of WQXI radio. The main one, which could substitute for a full on-air studio, fully equipped, and then this little room with a little 4-pot Sparta console, an Ampex 350, an Ampex 602, a turntable, and a cart machine. And that's the room that Larry and I worked out of. We started doing these commercials together back there, and the sales staff would go out and try to get clients. And before we knew it, we started getting work to do commercials for people in Atlanta and outside Atlanta. And I would do the voices, and I would engineer the sessions. I would do all that. And Larry would write, and we would both produce. And we came up with these great things. One of the things we came up with was this chain of stores called Nobody's Perfect. And I think they were out of, might have been out of Knoxville or Nashville, but they sold imperfect clothing. And the name of the store was Nobody's Perfect. And the commercial we came up with, there was an album that had come out of old radio shows, and one of the things they had was like The Shadow, and they had the music on there. So I used that in one of the commercials. But way back, I think it was the 1930s and 40s, there was a show on radio called The March of Time, and it was Time Magazine, and they would come up with the news of the week, but it would be dramatized. They would not be real news stories. They would be dramatized, and they would get actors to act as the part of the characters of the people who made the news. But the announcer on the program was a man named Westbrook Van Voorhees. And Westbrook Van Voorhees was known as the voice of doom. This is Westbrook Van Voorhees. You know, it was just, well, I was playing around in the back in the production room, and I found that if I put, you remember Flair pens? Well, the early Flair pens, I still have a bunch at home, but if you take the Flair pen top and take off the little pocket thing, the little metal thing that holds in your pocket, and you put that around the little wheel of a tape recorder known as the capstan, it would speed up the process. It would make the machine run faster than the 7.5 inches per second. So I found that when I did that during the recording process and played it back at normal speed, the voice would sound like that. So my voice being not a deep voice, I could kind of get away with this. And all I had to do was speed up the reading to make it sound like a real voice, like not a slowed down voice, but a real voice. So I was able to nail Westbrook Van Voorhees. And I came up with a character called Eastbrook Van Northfork. And I can't tell you how many commercials we did in the voice of Eastbrook Van Northfork. We did, let's see, there was Hub Ford in Atlanta, and then other Ford dealers would hear it and they'd want us. So we did Walker Ford in Augusta, and then Kelly Ford and Lincoln Mercury in Jacksonville. And we're doing all these commercials in the early 70s. And they sounded, I mean, to this day, they sound good. They sound great. And this voice was just, I could get away with murder with this voice. And I put together a demo reel with Eastbrook Van Northfork. I have one just for laughs. But that was one of the things we did. And we did all kinds of just crazy commercials. And they sounded good. We did movie trailers. We did all kinds of things in this little production room in the back. So that was that got me into doing a little bit more voice work. I was able to stick some of that stuff on a sample tape, but still I couldn't get arrested with Atlanta voice agents. None of them wanted to hire me, and I really still had the responsibility of being the operations manager of WQXI FM, and I didn't want to get out too much. If a job came up, yeah, I'd go out and do the recording session and come back. But there weren't that many jobs outside the station. Anyway, when I started at 96 Rock, I was off the air at 10 o'clock. Maybe had to record a commercial or two. So I came in a suit and tie. I mean, I wear a T-shirt on the air, and then when I got off, I'd put on my shirt and tie and go out and hit the streets and knock on the doors of ad agencies and speak with people. I'm not a very forward person, and I don't go out like that, but I worked at WQXI, really saw a lot of record promoters. And one of my favorite people, one of my best friends was Al Monet, who used to represent A&M Records. And I said, Al, do you mind if I come down and watch you work the phones? He worked at the London Records distributorship where his office was. He says, no, Jeffrey, he said, come on down. You can watch me. So I'd watch him work the phones, and it gave me a little bit more courage to go and work the phones and call ad agencies and talk up myself and say, I would love to play you my tape. Well, this was 1974. In 1975, there were actually a couple of ad agencies that gave me a shot at the same time. And one was Six Flags Over Georgia, and the other was Richway, which was a subsidiary of Rich's department store. And the Richway stores were the forerunners of Target in Atlanta. A number of the Target stores are in the old Richway buildings, but it was just a different way to shop. So I became the voice of the Ragman, which is the young man's clothing line. And those two things hit the air at about the same time, and that started giving me credibility. And I started picking up more work. Well, it was, I started picking up here and there good accounts, getting heard more on the air. And it was in, the income I was getting from doing this voiceover work had already eclipsed what I was earning at the radio station. And I was then getting the interest of some voice agents in town, and it was easier to get some work. Well, I started on a campaign in 1975. It was during that time when the Coca-Cola company was given just a nasty slap in the face by their competitor, Pepsi. And from what I understood, there had been a gentleman's agreement between the two companies never to go compete brand Coke against brand Pepsi in a taste test. Well, Pepsi broke that rule, and they had what they called the Pepsi Challenge, and this was in 1975. What they did was they went to Dallas and Detroit, and they took Coke drinkers and gave them Coke and Pepsi, and they liked Pepsi better. So they formed a whole ad campaign about that called the Pepsi Challenge. So Coca-Cola was quite disturbed about that. And during that time, I was starting to pick up more voice work, and I was sent over to Coke's agency, McCann Erickson, in Atlanta to do some demo commercials for Coca-Cola to go up against this Pepsi Challenge. And to me, I just knowing commercials and just having I didn't think they were very effective. They were just sort of repeating, taking Pepsi drinkers and finding people like Coke better, but that wasn't going to fly. Well, there was an upstart agency in Atlanta, McDonald and Little, and a number of the people there, I mean, they were just a hot agency, wonderful, and I was starting to get work from them, and they came across an idea. A lot of the people there were former Coke advertising, creative, sales, whatever, with ad agencies, and they knew the product, they knew the people, and they spoke with Coke, and Coke said, we have two problems. We have the Pepsi Challenge, and we have Fresca that's up on the shelves gathering dust. So an ad campaign, an idea came together, and they said, well, what if we take Fresca and run it up against Pepsi and see what happens in a taste test? So they went to Miami and did these commercials, these testimonials with people who were Pepsi drinkers who tasted Pepsi, and they tasted Fresca, and a lot of them liked Fresca better. So they said, we got an ad campaign here. And I was to be the voice on this ad campaign. And they kept, the statistics kept changing. And finally, after months and months and months, they gave me a call and they said, this is going to finally hit air. And we're going to do it. And you're going to be the voice. And it was still, in all the years I've done commercials and I've worked on major campaigns, this is still the largest I ever worked on. Because what it did is it took every bit of time buys that they bought for different Coke products, and these Fresca commercials were going to run in its place. And that it would include Coke and Sprite and Minute Maid and anything else that Coke owned, and these Fresca commercials was just going to blitz. And they ran for a couple of months, and I got a tremendous amount of exposure on that. And it was that was in early 1976, in the spring of '76. And I, at the time, I was starting to really have a nice income from doing this commercial work. And I spoke with some people, and I said, well, why can't I take what I'm doing in Atlanta and take it to a higher level? And someone suggested a book, The Magic of Thinking Big, written by a old professor at Georgia State, David Schwartz. I read the book. I started thinking a little differently. And I went up to New York and spoke with a voice agent up there, and they were interested in using me, but not if I lived in Atlanta. And I said, well, what do you suggest that I do? And I was still at 96 Rock. And he said, well, why don't you take a leave of absence from the radio station and come up here and try this for a little while? And I did. From Thanksgiving to Christmas of '76, I took time off from 96 Rock, a leave of absence. And they sent me on dozens of auditions up in New York, and I didn't get a single job. But I knew that it just didn't fall my way, that this is an opportunity that's just too great to pass up, to be with one of the best voice agents in the world who was interested. And I was still earning, I think, enough money in Atlanta doing voiceovers to live. I spoke with my dear wife, Beverly, about it. I told her what I'd like to do. I said, I really want to do this. And she says, well, you do what you love. And if I have to go out and work, I will. And we had a 4-month-old son, Joe, and a 4-year-old son, Jared. And I gave my notice to the radio station at the end of 1976. And they said, well, can you hang around till we get a replacement? And I said, sure. So in the meantime, New York kept calling, and they said, can you come up for this audition? So I get Dean Clark, who came on the air when I got off at 10 o'clock, and I said, Dean, can you spot me 15 minutes? Can you come in at 9:45 and take over after my last speaking, before my show was over? He said, sure. So 9:45, he would take over. I'd run to the airport. Back then, we didn't have the security we have these days, to catch a 10:30 flight to LaGuardia. And I'd get up to LaGuardia about 1:30, go to the audition, catch a plane back to Atlanta, sleep at the Atlanta Townhouse Hotel, because I get back late at night, do my shift in the morning at 6 o'clock, go home and crash. Well, this happened a number of times between the beginning of 1977, by the time I left the station in June of '77. So I couldn't do this very often. It just wouldn't work. So finally, in June of '77, they found a replacement. Skinny Bobby Harper was going to wound up taking my place on 96 Rock. And the first day I went up to New York, they sent me on 4 auditions, and I scored 2 of them. And one of them went on network TV immediately and started drawing an income. And I never looked back. And it worked from then on. And that was for Playtex Free Spirit bras. And if you look it up, it's on YouTube, because it was it was one of those commercials that was a turning point in the world of advertising, because here was Playtex making bras for women who decided they were going to burn their bras. And so Playtex came up with a bra that was sort of bra-free, free spirit. So, like I said, it's up on YouTube.
What was the cell line? Do you remember? The slogan?
Slogan. No, it really didn't have one, but when I did that, I did some other Playtex. I did Support Can Be Beautiful, and that was And that, of course, that line was, "Support can be beautiful," and it used a wolf whistle in there. You know, that was, of course, you'd never get away with that now. That commercial is also up on YouTube as well. But the ad agency I did that for was Ted Bates, and my New York agent, wonderful guy, Chuck Trainum. He said, "Jeff," he said, when you're working up here, he says, "you're going to find that there are ad agencies who won't give you the time of day. You'll never work for them. And there are some that'll take a liking to you." Well, Ted Bates Advertising, luckily, took a liking to me. And from Playtex, I then went to do the candies of M&M Mars, and then became the voice of Dynamints, which was sort of a Tic Tac made by the American Chicle Company, people who make Dentyne. And then I became the voice of Trident Gum, and that was a great account, and I did that for almost 4 years, and it was great. And there were some other agencies that took a liking to me as well. Well, Chuck Trainum had mentioned he would not represent me if I lived in Atlanta. Well, I made it work. I commuted to New York. When I look back on it, it was on average about every other week. I would go up on Tuesday morning, catch a 7 o'clock flight to LaGuardia or Newark, and I would be on the street of New York by 9:30 in the morning, and then I would leave Thursday afternoon. So that would give me Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday in New York, Monday and Friday in Atlanta. But of course, if ad agencies need something and they need it now, I had to be there. There wasn't ISDN, or there wasn't ways you could work remotely. You had to be there to do it. So I would do that and fly back and forth, and did that for well over 20 years, and wound up doing basically network TV commercials for about 28 and a half years of being heard on network TV, continuous.
You should probably explain what ISDN is.
ISDN is a technology that came about by using multiple telephone lines, and these telephone lines would connect from any studio that had ISDN lines. They could interconnect with each other, so it would give a solid connection, and it would sound like you're actually in the studio. It would be a full bandwidth connection. So it was almost as if you were there, high quality.
Yeah.
And of course, I have that at home now, but ISDN is becoming passé now because people are beginning to use, well, they've started using the internet, and the internet has become a way to hook up digitally, and it's become a fairly confident way of connecting. Things that I do now from home, I do 99% of what I record is at home. Very rarely do I go to a studio anymore. And the studio I have at home is really as professional as most recording studios out there. The equipment that I use that works through these ISDN lines is exactly what a studio would have, the same equipment.
So let's talk a little bit about the Georgia Radio Hall of Fame, because you are one of the inductees for much of your work in Atlanta radio and for your voice work. How do you feel that the Georgia Radio Hall of Fame is representing the industry, and how do you feel about being inducted?
Oh, gosh, I'm so honored to be inducted, to be part of this. It's, in my days, in being the operations manager of WQXI FM, I had the opportunity to represent the station at meetings of the Georgia Association of Broadcasters. So I was elbow to elbow with station owners and other program directors and people like that. And it's such a vibrant, the state of Georgia is such a vibrant radio market. People talk about what happened to radio. Radio really it's a small business. It's a mom and pop business, and there are still some stations that exist like that, where they're not making a ton of money, but they're serving the community, and that's what radio stations really are for. And when these corporate owners started buying up a lot of these mom and pop stations and all kinds of radio stations, they had to, I guess, justify their costs by cutting expenses. And by cutting expenses, you're basically taking the soul out of a lot of these local stations. And I will say that in my experience, Georgia still has its share of mom and pops and people who are seriously in it and seriously serve their communities and still have real radio stations. You know, could be again, many of these corporate owners, they have to look at the bottom line, and it's basically a jukebox. The personalities they have on the air could be sitting in another city and being the voice of 20 radio stations, really not having a connection with that town and what's going on, at that moment. So
you see these people being recognized at the Georgia Radio Hall of Fame events?
I do. Oh yeah, I'm so proud to be part of that. Everybody who was inducted this past year, that I went in with, they all have that, that local love and that ability to communicate with people, and something that goes way back. And I learned this very, very early on. And I think it goes for most everything, but really for radio. When you're on the radio, when you're speaking with people, you're not speaking to an audience. You're speaking to one person. And I remember at WQXI FM, and anybody that was on the air, I would always tell them that make sure you're not an announcer. You're speaking to one person, and it's almost it's a one-way conversation, but it's conversational, and you can communicate, and that's why radio is really one of the most effective forms of communication with the voice. And people who do it well are handsomely paid, and they're worth every nickel of what they do, and talented.
Great advice. And I'm going to ask one more question, because I think you've kind of touched on it before, and it's somewhat involved in what you just said, but you've been so involved in creating commercials, and you clearly have a love for it. If you could give someone advice, what makes a great commercial? In Cliff Notes, what do you think how would you pass on information so that someone could create the kind of commercials that you're proud of?
Commercials can run the gamut. They could be voice only, and you could do that with a way of communication that could be. You'll know it when you hear it. When you hear a good commercial, somebody could be soft-spoken. You'll understand everything they're saying. There's a great believability in what they're saying, and you'll be moved by it. I always love music in commercials, the jingles, the way the music is done. When I started doing the commercials in New York, and this was really at the highest level of commercial making, and I would go into the recording session, and usually the voiceover is one of the last things that's done on a commercial. And when I would go into the session to do it, the music would be on there. Now, this would be the first time I would be hearing the commercial, and I'd hear the music, and I would say to myself, these people are geniuses. The music they come up with is just instantly, maybe not recognizable, but instantly likable. And there's something about it. One of the commercials I did when I was up there, and to me, these guys are superstars. And these, unfortunately, it's Pepsi Cola. But the music in the Pepsi commercials has always been tremendous. And I have always loved it. And I have them in my collection. Come Alive, You're in the Pepsi Generation. Taste that beats the others cold. Pepsi pours it on. Well, the radio commercials were just great. Well, I was hired to be the voice of one of their new products called Pepsi Free. And I went up to the recording session, and who's there? The guys who write the music. And I was in awe. And I couldn't stop talking with these guys and just telling them how they almost threw me out. But I was just so enamored of what they had done. And I just love this, the genre of the music and just everything that goes into it. Some commercials obviously are tune-outs and they're, not worth it. But the ones that are done well, just great.
Fast round. Favorite commercial you did?
Well, that came about from when I was at WQXI FM and working in the back and doing these things, and I was starting to pick up some doing commercial work. In the AM station, they had a production man who would work the studios. He was not a disc jockey. All he would do is put together the production for the radio station, for AM. His name was Jim Gartner. And he asked me to come back there occasionally and voice some things like promos for the AM station. He says, I just got a national sound. I just sounded, different. So he liked using me. Well, he left the station and he decided to join the Mormon church, wanted to become a Mormon. And he moved to Salt Lake City. And this was, a year or two since I had seen him. And I received a call from him. He started working at one of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints arms, which is Bonneville Productions. Bonneville Productions also did radio programming, and they did some beautiful music formats as well. But they also had a production studio there, and Bonneville Productions was where these great commercials were put together for the Mormon Church. They called it the Homefront series. Well, Jim Gartner was a creative guy there, and he called me and said, I'm going to present you to be the voice of these commercials we're doing, these PSAs for the Mormons. And he called back and said, you got it. He said, we're going to fly you out. And he flew me out over the weekend. And this was in 1976. Because I did this the weekend before our son Joe was born, which was July 19th of 76. So it was the weekend before, and he flew me out to Salt Lake City, and I did these voiceovers for the radio commercials. They were exquisite. As a matter of fact, one of the commercials won the top Clio award the following year. But they were just great, and they were used throughout the late 70s and then they reintroduced them into the 80s as well, and they ran them. Just well done.
Cool. Jeff, thank you so much. This is Dennis Winslow. We've been speaking with Jeff Winter, inductee into the Georgia Radio Hall of Fame last year in 2018. This is January 30th, 2019, and we're in Roswell, Georgia.